When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in 1945, a strange and somber quiet settled over the continent. Cities once vibrant with life now lay in ruin. The war that had consumed millions had finally ended, and the victors began the uneasy work of rebuilding what was left. For many Germans, defeat meant more than surrender. It meant captivity. And among those taken prisoner were not only soldiers but also women, nurses, clerks, helpers, and civilians swept up in the machinery of war. To these women, the approach of American troops brought fear. For years, Nazi propaganda had warned them that the Allies, especially Americans, were monsters. They were told that if captured, they would be humiliated, abused, or worse. So when surrender finally came, many German women trembled as they waited for what they believed would be their punishment. But what they encountered instead was something entirely unexpected. In the spring of 1945, as American forces swept across Germany, they liberated towns, villages, and makeshift hospitals filled with wounded German soldiers and nurses. Among them were women who had served the Wehrmacht in various roles, secretaries, radio operators, and Red Cross volunteers. These women were not combatants, but by association, they were treated as prisoners of war. When the Americans arrived, they expected to see hatred in the faces of their captors. Instead, they saw something else: weariness, confusion, and a strange, almost quiet sympathy. The U.S. military, guided by the Geneva Convention, had strict rules about the treatment of prisoners. Food, shelter, and basic dignity were to be provided regardless of enemy status. For many German women, this adherence to fairness was difficult to believe. One former German nurse later recalled, "I thought they would strike me or drag me away. Instead, one soldier handed me a blanket." Another remembered how an American guard offered her chocolate, something she hadn't tasted in years. To a woman who had lived through bombings and starvation, that small gesture seemed impossible. The POW camps that held German prisoners in Western Europe and America were, by the standards of the time, humane. The U.S. took more than 370,000 German prisoners to America between 1943 and 1946. A smaller number were women, rare cases of female auxiliaries and civilian internees. Many of them had been captured in France, Belgium, and later in Germany itself. When they arrived, the prisoners were astonished. Instead of the cages or slave-like labor they had imagined, they found barracks with beds, showers, and regular meals. They were required to work, often on farms or in factories, but they were paid in camp currency and treated with a surprising level of respect. Some women wrote letters home describing their disbelief. One wrote, "We are being treated like humans again. I still cannot understand it. The men we were told were beasts are giving us food and shelter." For the American soldiers, most of whom had seen the horrors of war firsthand, these women were not the enemy anymore, they were simply people caught on the wrong side of history. Many were barely older than the soldiers themselves. Some had brothers or fathers who had died in the same war. The Americans, exhausted and longing for home, often felt a kind of pity for them. In one camp in France, a group of captured German women were assigned to cook and clean for the American administrative units. They feared they would be harassed or abused. Instead, they were left largely in peace. They were watched, of course, but treated professionally. One guard recalled years later, they were polite, quiet, and terrified at first. It took weeks before they realized no one meant them harm. The contrast with the Eastern Front was stark. Those who had fallen into Soviet hands faced an entirely different fate: harsh interrogations, forced labor, and years of captivity. Many never returned. The women who ended up under American or British custody often thanked fate that they had not been captured in the East. Back in Germany, as occupation zones were established, German civilians, especially women, faced hunger and uncertainty. But the Americans, following General Eisenhower's orders, distributed food and medical care where possible. In many areas, American soldiers shared rations with local families. They weren't saints, there were still crimes and instances of misconduct, but on a broad scale, the policy of restraint and discipline was upheld. In camps across America, places like Camp Ruston in Louisiana or Camp Swift in Texas, female POWs often worked in administrative or domestic roles. Some volunteered to help in camp hospitals, tending to both German and Allied prisoners. The American guards were often astonished at their professionalism and quiet dignity. Over time, a strange rapport developed. Prisoners and guards began to talk. Many Germans, including women, were surprised to discover how little hatred the Americans carried. The soldiers spoke of baseball, families, and music. Some played harmonicas by the fences. In return, the women told stories of ruined cities and missing loved ones. The war had stripped both sides of innocence, but in captivity, there was something human that flickered back to life. In 1946, as repatriation began, thousands of prisoners, including women, were sent back to Germany. They returned to a nation in ruins. Many described their time in American custody as surreal, a brief period where, for the first time in years, they were treated decently. Some even wept when saying goodbye to their guards. One woman later wrote, "They had every reason to hate us. But they did not. That is something I will never forget." This attitude of mercy became one of the quiet successes of the post-war period. While vengeance could have easily ruled, the U.S. military chose discipline and law. Historians believe this approach helped lay the groundwork for Germany's eventual recovery as a democratic ally. Of course, not all experiences were gentle. Some women faced harsh interrogations, suspicion of espionage, or anger from displaced persons and liberated prisoners. Yet, in general, compared to what had been expected, the Americans' restraint stood out. For many captured women, the true shock came from realizing how much they had been lied to. Nazi propaganda had painted the Allies as brutal conquerors. The reality they witnessed was far more complex. They saw soldiers who, despite having seen their own comrades die, refused to become monsters. One account from Bavaria tells of a young German radio operator captured in the final days of the war. She was exhausted, hungry, and terrified. When she surrendered to an American patrol, she expected to be mocked or assaulted. Instead, the sergeant offered her a cigarette and a place to sit. He asked only for her weapon and identification. She later said that moment shattered everything she had been taught about the enemy. There were also cases where American soldiers stood between German women and revenge-seeking locals. In one town, U.S. troops intervened when civilians tried to punish women accused of aiding the Nazis. The Americans insisted they be handed over for formal processing instead of mob justice. In the larger view, the story of German female pows is a small but powerful chapter in the moral aftermath of World War II. It reminds us that even amid destruction, humanity can survive. These women, nurses, helpers, secretaries, saw firsthand that mercy can exist even after unimaginable violence. Some years later, a few of these women would return to America, not as prisoners but as visitors. They wrote letters to former guards, thanking them. One wrote simply, "You showed me that even after war, decency lives." As the years passed, the memory of those camps faded. But for the women who lived it, the experience remained a paradox. They had lost their country, their cause, and their faith in everything they were told. Yet in defeat, they found something that resembled dignity again. When historians look back at that era, they often focus on generals, battles, and politics. But within the quiet corners of history are these smaller human stories, moments where compassion broke through the rubble. And perhaps that is what defines true victory. Not the destruction of an enemy, but the preservation of one's humanity in the aftermath. By the late 1940s, as Germany began to rebuild under Allied supervision, many of those same women began working again, some as translators or aid workers in the new order that replaced the old Reich. They never forgot what they saw. They told their children and grandchildren stories of the Americans who could have treated them as enemies but instead treated them as people. And those memories stood in contrast to the ruins around them. In the rubble of war, small acts of kindness became the first stones of peace. In the end, their shock was not from cruelty, but from mercy. The American soldiers, carrying their own grief and trauma, still chose to be decent. And in doing so, they changed how their former enemies would remember them, not as conquerors, but as men who proved that even in the darkest times, the light of humanity can still burn.